Welcome to the Filmlings podcast.
A bi-weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 102, World War II, People and Politics.
I was about to say, it's way easier to keep track of the episodes this season.
We're back down
we've reset
to
to ones and twos.
Yeah.
Everything just has 100 in front of it and will for like 4 years.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I mean, next season won't be so easy because it starts off 25. Anyway, so we are continuing with the World War II series this week. Remember, that's a 5-episode series. We kicked off the series and the season last week by talking about propaganda and kind of like the ideas behind the war and how that's represented in film, kind of how like documentary film was both birthed and evolved through the propaganda created in World War II.
Thanks to Frank Capra, we got like a really bird's eye view of the entire war. Basically all the battles,
especially
and the whole
if we watched
thing.
all 7
which we
films.
did.
I finished this. Did you finish this?
I finished them all.
Okay, good, because there's quite a few. Thankfully, they're short. It's more of like a Netflix series. They're all like 50 to 60 minutes, except for Battle for Russia, which is
that was like
really long.
Twice as long, yeah.
Anyway, so this week we're going a little lower. We're going to talk about biopics made about the World War II era, none of which were made during the World War II era, which makes sense. Biopics are typically made looking backwards. And these all kind of happen at the political level, which is typically most common, with the exception of something like Sergeant York, which was made in the late 40s, early 50s, I think.
Is Sergeant York a fictional retelling, or is it an actual person?
That depends. Well, it was based on an actual person.
Okay.
But it's obviously Hollywoodized.
Okay.
If that makes sense, especially because it's high classical era Hollywood.
And I want to double check this, but I think Sergeant York is set during World War One.
It might be.
My IMDb is not loading.
But anyway, that's a good example of a...
Yeah.
Either way, that's a good example of a biopic that's made about a war at like the soldier level or like the low-ranking level.
And we're actually...
For the most part,
yeah,
you typically get the biopics about the people involved at the high level, which kind of makes sense. They're the people with the most... maybe not the most story to tell, but with their story best recorded.
Yeah.
The story that as it's happening, most people are aware of. People are most aware of like kings and political leaders and generals, all of which we're going to talk about today.
And I think specifically in today's context, these are, to one degree or another, the decision makers, like the people who you would expect to have an influence on the outcome of the war. And so all of the biopics that we're looking at today are from the Allies' perspective. And they are people who, again, more or less, because some of the films wrestle with that, like how much power do these people actually have? But arguably, these are people with more power than others to determine the actual outcome of such a big conflict.
Yeah. And obviously, we'll discuss a little bit with each film how... the weight that comes with that,
right.
You know, like how privileged of a view do you take when you're depicting somebody at that high of a level? How much does it relate to the people who are really, you know, taking the brunt of the war? Obviously, none of these people are right on the front lines. Some of them get close, but none of them are right up there doing the fighting. Yeah. So how does that impact
Patton,
them?
Kind of. Yeah.
Patton is by far the closest.
Yeah, definitely.
But you know, there's some things like when we get to the Churchill movie, where it's like. It's a little like saccharine in a way, but
even Churchill, you could argue, has more of an impact than say King George VI did as more of a figurehead, which is part of what that movie struggles with. And we're gonna get into all of that.
Yes, for sure. So let's talk about the movies we're talking about today. The first of which is Patton from 1970, directed by Franklin J. Schaeffer. It has.
Remember last time we saw Franklin J. Schaeffer?
What was the last time we saw Franklin J. Schaeffer?
The original Planet of the Apes movie.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Those are two sort of different movies.
Very different. A lot of outside work, though.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It actually had 2 writers on it, but I'll spare everybody and only tell you the one that you know, who is Francis Ford Coppola, who actually won the Oscar for this movie. Yeah. And this was kind of before he, you know, did his Godfather work. And this is kind of what helped him make the Godfather work, as we talked about.
And then also his kind of epitomal war film, which is Apocalypse Now.
Of course. Yeah. This obviously has a lot of connection to that. from the creative standpoint. But just all of these are highly awarded movies.
Absolutely.
This won a bunch of Oscars, including Best Picture, Best Actor for George C. Scott, who actually refused his Oscar.
Oh, okay.
Saying that no performance should be judged against another. They all should stand alone. Like, it's hard to compare two performances.
Okay.
Which is a much more artistic approach to refusing the Oscar than what Marlon Brando did, which is half political, half throwing a hissy fit at the rest of Hollywood. It also won Best Director, Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Art Direction, Best Sound, and Best Film Editing. It, of course, had a bunch more nominations, including Best Cinematography, Best Special Effects, and Best Original Score. We're going to follow that today with The King's Speech from 2010, directed by the guy who did Cats.
Gotta bring it up.
Tom Hooper. And now that I've watched this movie, knowing he's the guy who does Cats, there's a lot of stuff in there that I'm like, this is the guy who did Cats. Yeah, 100%.
Man.
But this one, unlike Cats, is going to win. Did win a lot of Oscars.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, they actually pulled Cats from the 4-year consideration.
Did
campaign.
they? I didn't know
yes,
that.
like the studio literally pulled it off the page, removed it from consideration. They're not doing the campaign.
What was it being considered for?
They just put it out
that's
there. They
that's
put
what
everything out there.
Campaign to get nominations, not even awards.
Yeah. But this one won Best Picture, Best Leading Actor for Colin Firth, which makes sense. Best Director. Yes, the guy who made Cats has an Oscar. I love that. It's so fun. Best Original Screenplay. It was nominated for a whole bunch more stuff, including Best Supporting Actor and Actress, Best Cinematography, Best Editing, Best Costume Design, Best Original Score, Best Sound Mixing, and Best Art Direction. And then finally, we're going to talk about Darkest Hour, not The Darkest Hour, which is how I always type it, which is unfortunate, from 2017, directed by Joe Wright. This one won for Best Makeup and Best Leading Actor for Gary Oldman, kind of going together there.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. And it was nominated for Best Picture, Best Cinematography, Best Costume Design, and Best Production Design. And that is all of the movies we're talking about today. Obviously, we've talked about this way back in episode 8, but biopics are ripe for Oscar bait type stuff, ripe for giving people the chance to do these really... I don't want to say groundbreaking, maybe showcase is the better word, like showcasing performances. Like, here are all these different, it's all about your character.
Because the material isn't really a risk, so your presentation can be a lot more kind of flamboyant.
Yeah. And it's all focused on the one person, right? Like, it's not, even movies that are made these days that aren't about ensemble casts, even if they have like a specific lead or two, tend to become much more ensemble than they used to maybe 20, 30 years ago and beyond. But biopics definitely have to narrow down to like one person. Yeah. Unless you're doing some kind of weird artsy plot thing where you view them through different things like Citizen Kane. But even that was a long time ago. So it gives an actor a chance to do that sort of work.
The acting is going to be a big deal in this episode.
Oh yeah, of course. So let's jump into it. First movie of today's podcast, Patton from 1970. Jason, take it away.
Patton from 1970. General George S. Patton, charismatic American general, makes his way through World War II. He bursts into the war during the North African campaign with his tough discipline, his signature style, and his always-attack philosophy. He quickly becomes one of the only generals the Nazis fear. His brash ego and personality leave him in constant friction with his fellow Allied commanders, and his strict soldiering ideals bring trouble between him and his men. Patton will struggle to reconcile his brilliant military mind with his penchant for making enemies out of friends in order to seize what he sees as a final chance for a true warrior's glory.
All right, Jonathan. So Patton, I'd seen this one before. I don't think you had.
No, this is the only one this week that I had not seen.
So what did you think of it?
The first thing that I'm bringing up is just like production kind of stuff. But like it seemed very... Basically, I was also thinking about the other two movies, which I have seen today, The King's Speech and Darkest Hour, which I feel like there's a consistency in the filmmaking there across those 7 years that I think is a more modern take on biopics, because I don't think you could make a biopic that's visually like Patton these days because it's
I don't think you would
very
make-
straightforward.
Yeah, I don't think you'd make a movie that looks like Patton
Yeah.
these days. It's a very 70s style.
A lot of deep focus, which is interesting because you don't usually do deep focus with color. And then towards the end of the movie, when it starts getting into the snowy scenes and stuff like that, it started feeling really like more modern. But like in the desert, there's like just a lot of kind of tans and grays and not very much contrast.
Yep.
And you can see like the sets and stuff like that in a lot of it. So once you get
shot
past
in
that,
the classic style. Yeah, it's very much. It's still a big budget Hollywood film that's being made after the classical era of Hollywood, and it is shot like classical Hollywood movies. Big, wide, open, kind of like, a proscenium stage. You have different angles on it. You can get creative with the shots still. You can get artistic, but it's not. The camera still feels pinned down in a way. It's always on the same side of every set. You're not moving around it in the same way that you start to see the film brats doing at the same time in the 70s, where you're getting into the scene and moving around in the scene. There's one or two shots that are zoom shots. I think specifically when Patton's looking through binoculars.
Oh, yeah.
But for the most part, it's very wide and very open. And you're right about the colors. I noticed the colors. My thought on the colors was that, one, it's done because you're forced to shoot an outside setting.
You're literally shooting in the desert, so there's a limit to that.
You want to keep a consistent color pattern. It's meant to be, and Patton's a character who has this element of mysticism to him, and they do it once or twice where he visits like the old fields of Carthage, where Carthage was attacked by the Romans and destroyed. Where he believes he was a warrior in a past life and yearns for this greater, bigger time.
Oh, yeah.
And so he's kind of almost upset that he's stuck in this less exciting time, this more boring time, this less glorious time. It's not heroic and colorful and grand. He talks at the very end of the movie about the Roman triumph, and it sounds like this big, grand thing. Yeah. And in contrast to how he ended his campaigns, just walking off into the sunset to this bland field. Well, which isn't how he actually died. We'll get into that. But the color palette almost feels purposeful in that way. And, it just kind of makes it simple if you're going to work in an army setting to do all that. All the greens, the browns, the tans, the beiges kind of work together like that.
Well, since you brought up the end, I have to bring that up because I think that was kind of my favorite part. Is I had started to pick up on this, and then it became an explicit part of the movie, is the quixotism of the whole thing and of Patton. And literally the last shot is him riding off, and all you see are fields, mountains, and a windmill. And that's literally
it's literally a windmill. Just literally chasing a windmill.
Because that's his whole thing, is wanting this glory of a bygone day. And then the exposition Nazi literally brings up that whole idea
the
of
exposition Nazi.
That's all they are.
The Nazis,
that's all they are.
Well, they do two things, which is really brilliant. One, they give exposition about what Patton's doing, his background and all that. And two, they give this really nice foil to his colleagues in that he's like the only general on the alley side who they are freaking terrified of. And it's partially because like the Third Reich is also entrapped in these ideas of like a mythical time of days gone by. Keyword mythical. And they see him kind of on the same playing field in a way, and they're terrified of him and his charisma. And he is a good general.
And also he's the title character of the movie.
And it's interesting. They actually respect each other. Really, they genuinely respect each other in this interesting way. Like he beats Rommel's forces, and as he's beating him, he's like, "I read your book." Not to Rommel. Obviously, Rommel wasn't there. And he wasn't.
But actually, he finds out that Rommel wasn't there because he expected him to be, and then he gets upset because he didn't come out.
If you beat Rommel's plan, you've beaten Rommel. But yes, it is. They actually provide like this really nice function within the movie.
Did you think that the Nazi base looked very futuristic, almost Star Warsy?
A little bit, right? But that's kind of part of it. They were meant to be big and imposing.
Hollywoodness of it.
I also like that Patton's bases kind of tracked with his character arc, like because they always come back to his command base, and at first it's like a pile of crap out in the desert, and it's still a pile of crap in Sicily, and slowly he gets into Italy and becomes this grand palace as his ego gets big, and then it goes back down again as he's kicked out, and then he goes back up again to a glorious thing there at the end until he gets canned, and then gets forced out, which was just a nice kind of production design way to track his development as well. How do you think the ideas or the way the war is handled in this movie relates to the ideological component of the war that we discussed last time with the propaganda?
In what sense? I feel like you have something specific you're going for.
Well, World War II is special in the sense that more than almost any other war, it's about like the ideologies.
Yeah,
right. And this is kind of very much focusing on the person. So,
but it's a very ideological person.
Very ideological person. But you can kind of shift and bend the ideologies of the war into how they impact the person and focus on that. And in that way, you're kind of coloring how the war itself is viewed.
Yeah. I don't think I picked up very much of like Patton's ideology seemed kind of separate from like, I'm fighting for this way of life. It was more like I'm fighting for a way of fighting, basically. Like he wanted to fight a certain way, and he kept getting shut down at every turn. But it was never like, we have to save America or the American way of life from these Nazis. It was, let me be the one that brings us to glorious victory, whatever victory that ends up being.
Yeah, it didn't have that same sense of desperation that we saw in all of the propaganda from last time. It didn't have that same sense of this is world changing. It almost felt confident from the get-go.
You know what I expected it to be at the very beginning of the movie? He gives this pep talk, and then the first thing that happens is he comes into I can't remember exactly where they were, but he has to shape up this ragtag group of soldiers, but we never see this shaping up happen. I thought it was going to be like a football movie where the coach has to come in and pull all of these slacker teammates together. But we come in, we see how disheveled the troops are, and then all of a sudden we just see that Patton has made them. And then I realized, okay, it's more about Patton than it is about rallying. If it had been about rallying the troops, I think we would have gotten more of that, like, this is why we're fighting kind of a thing. But that's not really what this movie's going for.
Yeah, that's closer to a blend that we're going to see next time on the show, where propaganda meets the soldier level involvement in World War II.
Right.
But this is more of like focusing on the interesting person who happened to live in interesting times more than it is focusing on the interesting times themselves.
Yeah.
And the whole movie is structured very nicely. It isn't like this arc throughout his campaigns and how it influences himself. The idea of himself versus how he has to act in the modern world to get as close to that ideal of himself that he possibly can. Because obviously he can't be Scipio Africanus. He can't be Julius Caesar. He can't be Napoleon. He has to be whatever the modern version of those is, as close to it as he can get.
I think that idea is kind of exemplified in probably one of the culminative character scenes anyway in the movie is when he has to come out and apologize for slapping the soldier. Yeah. Which is him basically having to bend the knee to modern civility and modern, because in his mind, in any other era of human history, human generalcy, he would have been hailed for that, basically. And like I think he even explicitly states that he would have had him shot if he could have, rather than just slapping him. And so that moment where he comes out and what he ends up giving a very graceful apology on pretty much every level. But you can tell how much it kind of crumbles his spirit as he's giving it. And then that slap that happens in the movie, which I guess we should kind of specify, is like there's a moment in...
There's a soldier suffering from
PTSD.
Clearly PTSD in the infirmary. Patton is viewing all the wounded soldiers. He sees all these soldiers who are wounded in a battle that he had pushed himself.
Yeah.
He was already feeling guilty about how he pushed it. And then he tried to rally this man from cowardice and then just took this brutal turn to berating him and slapping him and
kicking him out of the infirmary.
Yeah, while there are journalists there, and obviously it gets out and people are not happy about it, and it becomes like this PR thing. And obviously an incident of that sort, getting out that wide, is a very modern concept. The concept of mental health is very modern. And it's not anything that would relate to the ideals or codes that Patton himself is living by. So that is very, very directly a running together of the two, of his past looking ideals and the modern looking way of life that are just colliding and making his hopes and dreams farther out of his reach.
And I do want to bring up this idea that this happens 3 or 4 times throughout the movie where he says some off-color remark and says, "This is off the record." And obviously there's no off the record. And he's talking directly to journalists.
Yep.
And then it gets out and he gets upset and like everyone's mad at him. And
oh yeah.
So that's another thing, is this whole idea of because he does express himself very well when he wants to and very eloquently, because he has such an affinity for poetry and literature and all this stuff. But his impulsiveness gets the better of him so many times. And I don't know what it is, if he just doesn't understand that there's no such thing as off limits for journalists or whatever, but he's constantly making these mistakes where he's saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. And then whatever great thing he just did is compromised because of that.
Whenever he's reveling in his glory is when he's most prone to doing that. And then, by the end of the movie, he's just making all these problems with the Russians.
Yeah. I forgot that with the Russians. Because this movie comes out like in the middle of the Cold War, doesn't it?
Definitely in the middle, in 1970.
Yeah, which is interesting that they would be so explicit about these Russia tensions. You'd think they would have played it cooler, but...
Well, they're kind of leveraging the fact that it's made from a post-war perspective, and they know the audience is going to have the idea when they see this that, well, Patton's right. Why is everybody getting mad at him? They're all being stupid.
Yeah.
And so it helps the audience take Patton's side even more.
Yeah. That element, if that's the case, doesn't come across the same way anymore at all.
Yeah, it's a little more confusing.
Yeah.
Although, Russia still is a boogeyman in a lot of ways. Definitely not Cold War levels.
Yeah. Usually you don't say that so blatantly, at least in a big public movie.
Yeah. Well, depends.
It depends.
I feel like we're moving closer back. I feel like we're moving back there.
Yeah.
I don't know. We'll see. But it's interesting because that's one of those things about how movies are viewed 10 years after they're made, 20 years after they're made, based on how things change.
And I don't think that it hinders this movie or anything, because it is first of all, it's probably, I haven't looked it up or anything, but I assume that that's probably Patton's actual,
he probably did something
position,
like that.
And things that he actually did. And the fact that it's from a period point of view, it kind of all goes with the territory.
Yeah, of course. And we should talk about how this movie ends. We'd already talked about it a little bit, but right before he walks off towards the windmill, he almost dies by getting hit by an ox cart. In real life, he actually did die in 1945 in Europe in like a small car accident. Where he wasn't wearing a seatbelt and he hit his head against the windshield.
Just a really undignified kind of...
And I think he went to the hospital for a few days and he passed away. But it's interesting that they put that in there, kind of like this inglorious death. But it's also interesting because I think the way the style in which warfare moved forward after World War II would have just appalled Patton. I think he would have absolutely hated the turn towards like these
drone
lengthy
warfare,
occupations, guerrilla warfare,
cyber warfare,
proxy wars, all this stuff. I think he would have
Cold War. Just the term Cold War.
The Cold War.
He
would have. Yeah, he would not have been ready for it. I mean, obviously, he was advocating for a hot invasion of the USSR right after World War II. But That's just an interesting little tidbit about the end of it. It would have been really interesting if he had actually died by getting hit by an ox cart, but that was not the case.
You know what? That. The fact that he did die in a small car accident reminds me of, and the other movie that I was coming back to over and over again watching this movie was Lawrence of Arabia, as kind of a biopic about someone with kind of a sense of grandeur about themselves and all this that kind of they have to come to terms with. So that's kind of interesting because that's how Lawrence of Arabia starts, is with the motorcycle accident.
All right, let's move on to The King's Speech.
The King's Speech from 2010. Prince Albert, the Duke of York and second in line to the throne, looks as though he will never have to ascend the throne, which might be a good thing since his stutter makes public speaking a rather painful experience. But Albert must continue making appearances at the command of his father, and having been to nearly every speech therapist in London, Albert turns to the unorthodox Australian Lionel Logue for help. A course of therapy which dives well beyond speech exercises to get towards the root of Bertie's speech impediment. But as the two form a tough working relationship and slow friendship, circumstances conspire to make Albert's ability to speak strongly and clearly over broadcast a matter of national importance.
I've seen this before. You've seen this before.
I actually own this movie. I like this movie a lot.
You own this movie. You and your mom made me watch this movie for the first time when I saw it. Yeah.
I don't remember that. Okay.
It was a long time ago, though. This came out when we were in high school.
Yeah.
All right.
I will say, I don't think... Not like it's the best movie in the world, but I enjoy this movie a lot.
It's an enjoyable movie.
Considering it's the guy who just made Cats.
For sure. Now, you definitely see notes of cats in here.
Okay, tell me the notes of Cats, Alex. I want to know what you're getting at.
There's a lot of stylization in this movie.
Oh, it's very stylized.
Very,
I like
very,
this
very
stylization.
stylized.
Yeah. But it's almost more like art house stylization.
It's very art housey.
Cats is the current trend of CGI overload stylization that a lot of movies since a certain Avatar have kind of had.
It was funny. Somebody posted an article yesterday that was from like the early in the last decade that said Avatar 2 is set to come out in 2015, which was hilarious.
Nope.
It might come out in the next decade. It might not. We'll see. But yeah, I'm talking about the stylization in the movie.
Okay.
Obviously, there's a lot of open framing, which is sometimes feels very purposeful when characters are talking to each other and there's a disconnect.
Sometimes not, though.
Sometimes not. Sometimes it just feels like it's part of the story of the movie.
Open framing to us.
Open frame. So closed framing is, you've got your box around a person, a single frame, and I'm looking, and most of the frame is in front of me. My head is towards the back. I'm looking into a space that's within the frame, and then
room
beyond.
To move.
You've got room to move within the frame. An open frame is when it almost feels like the character is interacting with the space outside of the frame.
Yeah.
So instead of the frame being here, it would be here with my face towards the front of the frame, or my head at the bottom of the frame. That's a very popular. It dwarfs characters. Yeah. It makes people feel smaller, makes people feel more disconnected, more...
it's becoming much more popular.
It's becoming very popular.
I think it's becoming more popular in unconventional ways because there are ways to use it. In the past, for example, there's a very famous shot in Jaws when the police, oh man, I can't remember the character's name right now off the top of my head, but he's throwing the chum into the ocean and then the shark comes up because we've left some extra space and then the shark fills that space. So it's used a lot in horror and it's used even in suspense films to at least give the idea that something might happen because something might come out, especially if the part of the open frame that is open is like an emptiness, like a hallway or something like that. In this film, and what's being done a lot more, is that it'll be like a wall, and it's literally just a different way of framing, still following the rule of thirds like to a T, but putting them on... Instead of the top third where the eye line is, it's on the bottom third, and that kind of thing. So it's very different. I don't know what kind of purposefulness it has in all the cases in this film. Sometimes it's used very well to create a claustrophobia.
Yeah,
because King George definitely...
He's uncomfortable everywhere all the time.
Definitely has
so
this
a lot of the
So I think that
scenes-
might just bleed into the overall tone of the movie.
Yeah, there's some nice ones. Whenever Birdie and Lionel are talking to each other, especially early on in their professional relationship and eventual friendship, there's a lot of open framing, which works because there's a disconnect between those two characters. There's a lot of an unexplored space. Yeah. But sometimes, it's like the one, I think the one that stood out to me, and from an editing perspective, it was put together well because the rule of thirds was still obeyed. A character was on the left side of the screen and a character was on the right side of the screen.
Yeah.
When
they're
we
having
cut
a
back and forth,
conversation.
and they're having conversation. But instead of looking at the two frames next to each other and they'd be looking at each other inwards towards the open part of the frame, it was the opposite. They're on the edges of the frames looking away from each other. I think it was Lionel and his wife, but it didn't really make sense in that context. It just felt like style, even though they weren't really looking at each other. It was just like, oh, let's make it look like this.
Yeah.
The other one that I saw a lot in this movie that was just like, it felt like it was there for visual flair, was the extreme wide lens. Whenever we get up real close, like the broadcaster gargling in the open sequence.
That's the very beginning.
That shot kind of bugs me a bit. I don't know why. It's
kind
almost like
of
I don't want to be
blatant.
that close to somebody gargling.
Which is the point. Like, they're trying to make you feel really uncomfortable about this guy. I mean, just to kind of make all of the speech coaches kind of have this awkwardness to them because we're going to have
Giving
to
a
warm
speech,
up
doing broadcasting
Yeah.
is an uncomfortable space for our character, and therefore should feel the same way to the audience, which makes sense. But it is sometimes a little
Jarring.
Now they use it a few times in and around Birdie, especially when he's interacting with like his father early on in the movie or something.
Or even a microphone.
Yeah,
Again.
which makes a lot of sense to me, because it's like, okay, here's an opportunity for style, and it makes a lot of sense. The character's super uncomfortable. Everything feels distorted and weird and way too close, and you can feel the pressure both in the character and the shot. I think it was less offensive when I watched this movie before Cats came out, and then I watched this movie after Cats came out.
Oh my gosh.
And I was like, oh, that doesn't bode well. Anyway, let's talk about the stakes in this movie, Jonathan.
Okay.
Because within the context of doing this right on the heels of our propaganda episode, where the stakes were the end of the world, going to the stakes of giving a successful speech.
Well, okay,
on paper, just
on paper, the stakes seem smaller.
It seems much smaller. So how do they get to the point where giving a successful speech equates to saving the hearts and minds of a nation?
Well, it goes back to the idea of propaganda. The whole idea of, if you can communicate successfully to your people why the nation is doing what it's doing, then you have willing recruits, you have willing fighters, you have better morale, and you're able to, get your people to do things for a reason other than "I told you so." But if you don't sound confident when you're giving those reasons, then it just becomes an "I told you so" and more like a "Hey, please,"
Please do this. Yeah.
So I think it's like if you have the right tools of communication and the method of delivering it, then especially in the context of the speech is where the stakes come from, not the speech itself. And I think that the film does a pretty good job of setting up the possibility of utter failure in that first scene where he gives the speech at the races.
Oh, it's just
It's just a
fall flat on your face.
Absolute disaster. Yeah. The thing that actually happened apparently is pretty well documented as a complete disaster.
Yeah. And it's really painful. I would also like to point out that the writer of this movie actually suffered from a childhood stutter.
Oh, okay.
And he actually came up with the original idea, the original concept of taking Prince Albert's story and turning it into, a movie way back in the 80s. But the movie itself was held off. I think it actually went to stage production first in like the early noughts.
So British of you, Alex.
I mean,
the early noughts, the noughties.
I guess that's what we've been calling it.
It really is the best word to use.
I mean, otherwise you call it the 2000s, and it sounds like you're saying the century.
The zeros. I don't know.
But anyway, it was actually postponed in deference to the Queen Mother, Prince Albert's wife,
right.
played by Helena Bonham Carter in the movie, until she passed away in like 2001, 2002, something like that. And then they proceeded with the movie afterwards. It was actually like a personal discussion between the two. But yeah, this actually has interesting stakes. So it comes from that very personal space, and the movie does take that bent towards exploring, like, why does Prince Albert stutter? Obviously, it's not a physical thing, it's a psychological thing, and doing that deep dive, which actually makes for a really interesting character arc and makes Colin Firth's performance much more than a person imitating stuttering.
Yeah.
Which is really cool. That makes it technically and emotionally impressive as an acting performance, which is what got him the Oscar.
Yeah. And speaking of the origins of the movie, because this is actually a real relationship. Lionel Logue was a speech therapist who helped King George VI through a lot of his speeches, especially early on in his kingship and beforehand, even when he was the Duke. And I was watching some of the behind the scenes features where there's a book of the same name written by the grandson of Lionel Logue, who, when his father passed away, found all of these diary entries that Lionel Logue had written during the time that he was, helping King George with his therapy and stuff like that. So a lot of these are personal anecdotes. Obviously, the timing is kind of reworked and stuff like that. Things that you kind of have to do with a biopic like this when you're trying to get the point across. But the relationship, I think, is fairly accurate. Probably some liberties taken with how casual they were together.
Yeah, it's a good way to structure the relationship. You have a very formal character, a very informal character, and in between being forced to be formal and desiring to be informal is the tension that drives our main character to stutter in the first place. But I do really like the way that the personal, because this movie starts in like 1936 or something
early.
like that, way before this guy even has a chance to become king, because he's second in line. Goes through all that drama up to World War II starting now.
Guy Pearce shows up on the podcast again, who is actually 7 years younger than Colin Firth.
Well, I mean, with the right amount of makeup, it works. But suddenly the personal stakes of not wanting to stutter anymore, wanting to be living up to the role of having to be prince and eventually king, suddenly takes on massive importance and kind of forces him to really dive deep and confront those personal issues and essentially accept his self-worth. Accept himself as being...
The fact that he has a voice,
Yeah, the fact that he has a voice, the fact that he is up to the challenge, if for no other reason than nobody else is.
Yeah,
so it's him or nothing, so he's got to do it. And that's how everything goes in this movie. And there's a lot of people who come in to make appearances. Churchill makes an appearance in this movie, although apparently him advocating the
marriage.
No, what do you call it? Stepping down.
The abdication.
Him advocating the abdication is apparently an anachronism.
Yeah, which is actually a contrast between this movie and the next movie, because they actually show him being on good terms with King George in this movie, which is not really the case. At best, the king was like lukewarm to him because he didn't like that Churchill approved of his brother's marriage and wanted him to, go forward with the marriage and still be king, which was a big no-no, just based on all of Britain's politics and everything.
Also, Churchill had a very spotted career.
Yeah, and
up
he was
to World War II.
He was
and they talk about it in the next movie, but he is not that. He was before World War II.
He had
and
an abrasive
after World War II,
personality.
very different.
Yeah,
very different. And even after World War II, he got kicked out of the ministry pretty fast.
Fascinating character.
But yes. So that's the King's Speech. It's got a really strong color palette. There's a very strong contrast. Both, like, they shoot with a lot of contrast. But also there's a very strong contrast in the 40 years between Patton and the King's Speech and the way biopics are constructed. Much less open, much more stylized. A lot of the filmmakers having fun with telling an already established story, where they have a lot less flexibility. So they're trying to go into the stylization of it, have fun with it. It feels a lot more artsy, feels a lot more modern. Obviously, it was only 10 years ago.
I would like to kind of talk about the acting and the performances, because I think for all three of these movies, like, they start to feel, especially when you get to well-established people like King George VI and Winston Churchill, when you're doing a movie focused on them, it's very much a chance for the actor to take on this big role, this big responsibility of portraying this person well, because obviously Colin Firth, as a British actor, wants to portray the king well, and a lot of people are going to come after him if he doesn't. So looking at these also as kind of like performance pieces, I think is really interesting. And obviously,
very much so.
Colin Firth and Geoffrey Rush are huge names, and they do have this really nice chemistry together when they're doing their sessions and stuff like that. And going through the whole tension of not knowing this guy, obviously they go through all of the awkwardness, and then they build this rapport, and I think that they do that pretty well. Also, Helena Bonham Carter being in such a grounded role is kind of different when you're used to seeing her a lot in Tim Burton and very over the top kind of roles.
Yeah.
But I think
she gave a really good performance. I was actually really disappointed when I watched this movie how little that role had to do compared with how much Helena Bonham Carter brought to the table. Like, I felt like she could have done a lot more over the course of the movie, or obviously it wasn't her who she didn't write the part. Right. Someone else did, but it felt like a very limited role. It was very much the supportive wife, and she was in there a little bit, very specifically.
But she played that role
and
perfectly.
She did phenomenally. Yeah. I would have loved to see more of that. But yeah.
All right.
It's a very good rendition for what it is, especially because from the guy who made Cats. Yeah. Anyway, on to The Darkest Hour from 2017. Jason, take it away.
Darkest Hour from 2017. In the spring of 1940, Neville Chamberlain is ousted as the Prime Minister of Britain's Parliament. Seeking to avoid war with Germany at all costs, he's viewed as far too soft. In place, Winston Churchill is elected to be Prime Minister, one of the few ministers to correctly predict the danger posed by Adolf Hitler. Meanwhile, France is falling, and the British Expeditionary Army has been forced into a full-on retreat to the Channel port town of Dunkirk. Churchill finds himself caught between the Chamberlain group, looking to trap him into either resigning himself or to pursue a peace treaty with Hitler, and the rest of the Parliament, who want to stand and fight. The world is crumbling, and Britain very well could be next. In this, The Darkest Hour, Churchill gives his blood, toil, tears, and sweat to hold the country together.
Do you think Congress yells as much as Parliament does?
Lately.
I'm sure.
Within the past 4 years, yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe even 10.
But I think that the opening shot of this movie where Parliament is just screaming at each other across the lines, like, it's so dramatized.
I mean, it's so funny that, like, modern politicians ever pretend to be, like, really calm and composed. When you look at the history of democracy and democratic bodies, you have, like, the French Revolution. They're all freaking chopping each other's heads off. Or you have, like, the scandal close to the American Civil War where another congressman beat another one with a cane in the middle of like a debate or something like that. There's all sorts of insane stuff. We've all seen Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. What's that That's crazy stuff going on?
Yeah, but still, the amount of like energy that was in that room in this first shot is very dramatized. Oh, yeah. But it gets you into the thing. It tells you like politics are high stakes. Politics are energetic because that's all this movie is going to be. It's going to be politics.
Yeah, this is a lot of politics, a lot of passion, passion mixed with politics. It is literally very dark, but everything's shot like a gorgeous like painting.
Yeah. It's very almost Renaissance.
Yeah, very Renaissance in a way. This light coming in through the window.
Chiaroscuro, if you want to be fancy about it.
Very deep shadows. It's a gorgeous movie. Even if Winston Churchill isn't a treat to look at. I mean, like even the opening shot of him is like almost purposefully like a little repulsive. Like he's sitting in bed with this big ass breakfast and like smoking a cigar and just like not dignified at all.
But and that's the thing, because this. I think the reason that I'm bringing up the idea of performance pieces is because this movie is a performance piece for Gary Oldman.
Yeah,
this is Gary Oldman. Yeah, putting on a character that is very physically different from himself, very, as far as I could tell, temperamentally different from himself. You know, this is Gary Oldman acting like Winston Churchill.
Yeah,
who is a well-documented and very
quotable.
Yeah, very distinctive personality.
Yeah.
So I think anyone who gets to play Winston Churchill jumps at it.
He's an asshole right off the bat.
Well, yeah.
He's a complex character. And over the course of the movie, you kind of explore, like... Because if you think of Winston Churchill now, you think of him kind of as like a little heroic, right? He's a leader. He got Britain through the war. He did good things. And then you meet Winston Churchill at the start of this movie, and he's none of those things. He's a political failure. He's a last option. He's literally a pawn.
And the first thing that he does is we bring in Lily James, who is just sympathetic to look at from the very beginning. She walks in, and he like slams the door in her face.
He's just a total asshole to her. Yeah. Speaking of Lily James real quick, she was great.
She's an exposition character.
She's an exposition character. There was almost nothing for her character to do.
She's us walking alongside when she gets us right beside Winston Churchill throughout the entire movie, because we can identify
for a lot of it. She's in the background for a few scenes.
She has a soldier.
She has a soldier fiance. I think he dies. He
was in Calais.
He's in the Calais garrison who Churchill has essentially go sacrifice themselves to distract the German line a bit. I think one of the biggest complaints I have about this movie is that they are so focused on the politics that they almost shy away from like the tactical explanations of what's going on in France. So it's kind of hard to understand.
Well, the movie has such a hard line because the politics that are happening are so complex that it's really hard to boil them down and make it interesting without doing like a Frank Capra, here's where the Nazis are coming from, and so they do it a little bit with the maps and the red pins and the blue pins, but it's hard to give all of that and make it about, turning Winston Churchill into a human being with his flaws and his quirks and all of that, and about so there's a lot they're covering, so they don't really hit anything perfectly. Yeah,
and I wonder about it only because it makes it like the vagary about that makes it feel like Churchill's decision to send that garrison over was either unnecessary or completely stupid, which I feel like they're kind of leaning towards. Although maybe it wasn't because of where they arrive at the end, where it's like, oh, we're going to fight to the bitter end, because you don't really get to understand the impact of what that did. Did it buy them any time? They didn't say. They didn't even say whether it was effective or not. It's all very kind of left up in the air.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if that sacrifice was the reason that the Dunkirk operation worked, because they always talked about Calais and Dunkirk at the same time, and Calais didn't work, but Dunkirk did work.
Yes.
So that's the correlation that I think they were trying to make that justified the Calais decision. I'm sure it was more complex than that, but for the purposes of the movie, that kind of helps, because it's like, this one didn't work, but because we were able to get so many more people out of Dunkirk.
Because it comes across, with the limited explanation in the movie, it just feels like an incompetent decision by Churchill. And so by the end of the movie, it doesn't feel like he's contributed to the success of the Dunkirk operation much beyond ordering the civilian fleet to go out, which he does like 2 times, which is kind of confusing.
Well, he calls about it, and then they're not sure if they can make it work, and then he calls again and is like, you've got to make this work. And so he does a lot of calling. I think what
I'm getting about a little bit of some of the political stuff doesn't feel very decisive. Like it feels, which I understand that's how it actually works, but it feels like he's making decisions twice. he's kind of teetering back and forth on things. It's like, is this the convicted character or is this the confused character? Sometimes he makes very decisive decisions. Sometimes he's just waffling. And obviously towards the very end, it feels like he's meant to be this character who's waffling back and forth on what to do until he has that really structured, for lack of a better term, scene on the bus.
The subway, yeah.
The subway.
Which I'm thinking that the going on the subway scene is going to start to be a trend in biopics, because they did it in the Mr. Rogers movie.
Oh, I haven't seen it.
Oh, okay. They did a similar thing where Mr. Rogers gets on a public transport and everyone recognizes him.
So let's talk about the bus scene.
Okay.
It's towards the end of the movie. And the big question over the course of the movie is whether or not you essentially surrender because it looks...
Or negotiate.
Essentially negotiate. Everyone is pretty clear that path is taken because there's absolutely... By people who think there's no way you're going to win. You think you're going to lose your entire army. You think, oh, well, Hitler's going to win anyway. Let's just go to the table with our hat in hand and see what deal we can get. And then there's the other side of the debate led by the opposition to the conservatives. Tories? I don't know. What happens in London? What happens in Britain? I don't understand. They have more than 2 parties. What's that like? I don't know.
One of them has a king. How does that work?
What does the king even do? Give speeches. Apparently. Yeah. He doesn't even he signs off on the prime ministership. Anyway. But the other side wanted to stay and fight to the bitter end. And so...
Well, kind of. Churchill, were actually... Both of them were kind of willing to compromise, because the side that wanted to fight was actually not the side that Churchill was on. He was in the other party.
Yes.
After he had done some flip-flopping
between the parties as well. They explored a little bit. He had a very questionable career. He had some failed military operations, which had good ideas behind them, but were ultimately failures. So still comes down to failure.
I think the whole idea of the movie is, because, again, Churchill is, out of the 3 of these biopics, Churchill has the most high-level, deciding power. Once he becomes the whatever it called, the prime minister, the leader of the party that he's working with, leader of the parliament. He's literally whispering in King George's ear every week and all that kind of stuff, or vice versa. I don't know how that works.
I don't know. Anyway.
But yeah, so he has the most power to actually get things done with the troops, because that's what Patton was fighting. He was fighting his higher ups, sending him places he didn't want to go, not being involved. So he had the power to control his troops, but not to control large sections of the war like Churchill does, even though he doesn't have boots on the ground, so to speak. Yeah.
Or clearly military expertise. He was floundering for quite a bit of the movie. But I think
that's the point. It's the scale of the conflict they were facing and the kind of almost unprecedentedness of it is something that you can't, it's easy to look back now and be like, well, of course we needed to fight Hitler and all this kind of stuff. But these are not easy decisions to make in the moment before you realize the extent of Hitler's evilness, for lack of a better term. And I think that that's kind of what the movie is getting at, is trying to take us back to a point where we didn't know the outcome of the war. We don't know how any of these things are going to turn out. So it's hard to make the right decision until you're looking back at it. You just have to make decisions.
It was a movie about choosing the harder path.
Right.
But anyway, getting back to the bus scene, which is how we got here in the first place. It's a very structured scene in which Churchill gets on a bus and asks the common people, which are conveniently...
Which these 20 people represent all of England, apparently.
All of England, and asks them whether or not they want to fight. And it's very... There's some interesting dialogue on Churchill's part, and there's obviously some very good acting, but everybody else feels very structured. It feels very convenient. Yeah. It feels very also constructed.
Which the scene did not happen in real life, but even if it had, I feel like you've got a skewed poll, because people are just going to say whatever sounds the most motivating in that moment. And I'm talking to the prime minister.
I'll say whatever he wants me to say. Right. I think he wants me to fight. I'll fight.
Yeah.
Hey, little girl, you want to fight? Yeah. You want to get bombed? Yeah.
Yeah. So it gets the point across, but
it's very heavy-handed.
Yeah, it's heavy-handed.
It's very heavy-handed. It's very constructed. I almost feel like they had to resort to that in a way because of what we've kind of been hinting around at, is that anytime you have to deal with something that is in a short time span and very, very, very complex, like you had 20 different factions talking, and different people want different results, and vagaries of you don't understand. There's like a political aspect and a commercial aspect, and the U.S. isn't involved yet, but hopefully they will be.
He's in talks with the president, trying to get destroyers and all that kind of stuff. They're doing
like horses over the border in Canada. Everything's so complex. You have to find a way to get that across to the audience that isn't going to come across like a freaking political science lecture in an advanced college course, and still be understandable. In both in terms of stakes and at the plot and the character and connect. So I feel like almost in this movie you get into like this weird middle ground where it's semi-understandable. Like you get part of the way there. I still come across, especially the second time I watched it. The first time I watched it, I came away with a lot of emotion. I came through the emotional arc of Churchill. I got that he was fighting against things. He felt surrounded on all sides, and he decided to stand to fight. And then the country decided to stand and fight. But the second time through, I kind of got away from that a little bit, and you notice that like I have no idea what are they talking about?
I think maybe it takes a third watch. You get the emotion on the first watch. You start to get the politics on the second watch.
It takes the third watch and then like a bunch of research.
And then research, because I feel like it's in there. It's boiled down a lot.
It's very boiled down.
I think it's in there, and if you're following the way that the movie is portraying it, you can get there.
Yeah. But there are a lot of loose ends and threads. Like there's like the junior cabinet that he goes to right before the end.
I don't know how that works.
And gets like support from. I'm like, who are these people? Who are these people?
And maybe that makes more sense to like British people who actually like have
maybe
some understanding like we do of the three branches of our government. Like we don't have to have the most extensive knowledge of our government, but we get
maybe introduce the junior people way back when. Maybe give some other info about how this all works in a very simplified version. It doesn't have to be completely correct. There can be a few inaccuracies, but as long as you're getting the point across, you're good. I keep coming back into my mind to the episodes 1, 2, and 3 of Star Wars, where you just get bogged down in like this weird political stuff. The original. Even though this is very different. But yeah. Anyway, the important parts of this movie, the cinematography, which is excellent, and the acting on Gary Oldman are both really good. And that works. Yeah. I think it's a one-watch movie, though. I think you shouldn't watch this more than once.
Okay.
That's
my
opinion.
I think it has enough to say about Churchill. Obviously, it's for people who have some understanding about Churchill and are fans of him. And then it just kind of, I think the other thing that the movie goes for is to humanize him from being, like you said, if all you know about him are his quotes and he's kind of this valiant leader.
Political
and
leader,
then
asshole.
Yeah, and then you see him in his pajamas ordering, young women around. Then, then suddenly you're like, okay, so which is probably pretty accurate because he had some rough around the edges.
Yes, if you read the quotes, it's very evident.
But he did a lot for Britain at that time. So there's a lot of facets to it. And Darkest Hour.
What do you think, real quick, just a smaller note, what do you think of the date stamps on this movie? Because they give date
big
scenes.
Dramatic ones.
Yeah, and I feel like I would have to go look them up. I feel like they almost would have been more effective if you said so many days until Dunkirk.
Yeah.
Or 30 days after the appeasement agreement where the previous prime minister and his party signed over the illegally annexed part of Czechoslovakia to Hitler.
Yeah. Because I think that when you're doing date stamps, especially like the way you do it in this movie over like a couple months, I think it actually spans a year or two.
It spans a long while for a movie called The Darkest Hour.
But really...
Or Darkest Hour movie.
the dates that I'm looking for in it are, 1941. Like how close are we to the point where they actually get the war started?
Yeah.
But like the really, like
when this
May
movie
19th,
started,
I don't know.
Yeah, when this war was declared in 1939, when this movie starts, war has already been declared. And if you listen to what they're saying in the movie, it doesn't sound like war has been declared at all. It sounds like they're trying to avoid war.
Yeah,
and it's not made very clear.
Yeah,
at all. It's actually, the more I think about it, the more confused it is politically. Which maybe I'm just stupid, but
yeah, maybe like if you go back and really check it off, but you're right. It should be something that, having very limited understanding of World War II, you should be able to follow it pretty easily.
First watch, I was just following the emotion. Mm-hmm. So that's what I'm saying. The first watch movie. Yeah. If you watch it the second time, you're already used to the emotion. You're used to the cinematography. You're used to the acting. So you start to pay attention to.
Did that happen?
Wait, did that happen? Wait, when was that?
Did that happen at the time?
Yeah, and you if you're watching it at home,
you can look it up,
or even in like your own private theater.
Yeah,
you have your phone right there.
But then you're not watching the movie.
Then you're not watching the movie. Then you're missing all the emotion. Yeah. Which is not good. You don't want that to happen.
Well, that's also up to viewer discretion whether you pull out your phone.
Well, it's viewer discretion, but essentially the goal should be to make a movie that doesn't make people want to reach the phones. Right. For anything other than, oh my God, this movie is so good, you need to watch it. Yep. That's the only reason that you want somebody to reach for a phone during the movie you made.
And hopefully they do that after the movie anyway.
Yes, hopefully. Anyway.
All right, let's talk about all three of these.
Yeah. Okay, Jonathan. So we've already talked about this a little bit, but why do you think these movies skew towards the higher levels of command, the higher levels of society?
I think that's not completely the case. So I think that in recent days, we've gotten a lot of these really high-profile type of biopics and stuff like that. But these are also the ones that we picked for this week. And they're kind of the first ones that come to mind, but there are a lot that are at a much lower level. So I'm thinking we're actually going to cover Schindler's List later on in this, which is basically a biopic.
Yeah.
There's one I have not seen yet called The Pianist.
I've seen it.
With Adrian Brody. There's Unbroken, came out a couple years ago, and then A Hidden Life even, which is in theaters, which we're going to be talking about on the bonus podcast soon, so stay tuned.
Which is a biopic.
Which is a biopic.
Purposely made about somebody who is essentially has a hidden life.
Yeah.
Is not a big flashy person.
Yeah, I think there is a good range of these biopics, but I also kind of feel like, well, I can't even say that's true, because I was going to say that these are kind of the big award showy ones, but even Schindler's List is definitely up there on that kind of artsy award grabby kind of a level. Yeah. And obviously it has a lot more to it than that. But I think that these are just kind of the first ones that come to mind, and some of the more recent ones, especially The King's Speech and Darkest Hour, that are still fresh in the cultural imagination.
The more I think about it, the more I think that these are the ones that the public already knows about to some extent.
Yeah,
or somebody knows about, or like they're identifiable. And then it's not that we don't tell stories about, the lower class on the front lines people, the people out of positions of power within a war. Not to say the powerless, although in some cases the powerless. But when we tell those, we're typically using, constructed narratives around a collection.
It's a lot easier to fictionalize the perspective of the everyman, so to speak.
Yes. One, because those things are a little less well documented, but also because sometimes when you get down that low, it's less about portraying a specific circumstance than it is about portraying a collection of circumstances about those people, because there's a wider range of people at that level.
Yeah, and it's a lot easier to take that experience, which is a general one for, how many people there were in the ranks, in the cities, in Europe, that kind of thing, and make a fictional movie that creates a bigger metaphor when you're not having to deal with the actual life of a person. So it's just, I feel like it's a lot easier to do that when you're creating the whole thing from scratch, and you still get across the experience, but it's a lot harder to fictionalize the story of someone higher up, like making these decisions. You can't fictionalize a prime minister.
It's almost inappropriate in a way, right?
Unless
you're doing
the
like
only thing I can think of
history thing.
is, like Dr. Strangelove, which kind of does that with all of these world leaders in the war room and that kind of thing.
Like either an alternate history or a false dramatization or alternate history or spoof.
Or satire.
Of some sort, which makes sense. But yes, anyway, one of the more interesting things about this angle of looking at World War II is that essentially using the shorthand common knowledge context of World War II, which most people probably know about in some regard, the ideals involved, the people involved, the sides involved, and using it to relate personal battles. Right? Like we all often talk about how you have to set up a world and set up a shorthand and the rules within the world. Well, World War II is kind of like an established world. So like, oh, what world is this set in? This is set in World War II. That's a ready-made box that you can be like, oh, this is what this is. And then if you can even set to almost ready-made characters, Winston Churchill.
Yeah.
We know
who is
him.
identifiable, like almost to cartoonish levels.
Yeah. British king. Even if you don't know the kings, the monarchs between Victoria and Elizabeth II get a little blurry for me, at least. Maybe if you're British, they don't. But yes, so it's a ready-made box in which to tell personal stories. So it kind of gives you all these things that are ready, set, go, a ready-made toolkit, and then you can bring in other stuff like your set design, your cinematography, your acting choices. Yeah, it's all ready to go. And because it's readily accessible, it kind of makes it a little more desirable for actors to throw their hat in the rings, makes it way more desirable for studios to throw their money behind.
Oh, yeah.
We've talked extensively about how they are looking for ready-made products.
Safe stuff.
Or stuff they know.
Yeah.
Just stuff they're comfortable with. They don't want crazy concepts. They don't like taking risks unless you're an established filmmaker. Jojo Rabbit. But even that's set within a World War II box.
Yeah.
So you're like, what kind of film is this? World War II.
Yeah,
it's
and you have like a satire of Hitler, which is, satirizing Hitler is almost a guaranteed hit too. So.
Or I would say it's not a subgenre. It's like the theme or the setting modifier. What is it? Drama. World War II drama.
Yeah.
What is it? Romance. World War II romance.
Well,
World War II biopic. World War II action.
Yeah. Because, you're right. Because war film is kind of a thing. And then World War II film is kind of its own thing. But not all World War II films are even war films because at some point you get to, even like Diary of Anne Frank, which isn't like there's not a battle movie, but it's a World War II movie.
It's very much a historic pin that you can put in something and have. It's relatively modern. It's big. Everybody knows about it. Every country was affected by it. It's relatable in a way that makes it more likely to be made.
And I think, the fact that it was a world war and virtually every country on the planet was affected by World War II in some fashion or another.
I mean, even if you weren't directly involved in the fighting, you were affected by World War II.
Yeah, whether it's refugees or whatever.
It was world-changing. Yes.
Yeah, it was world-changing. And so I think that that also broadens the scope of the types of stories that can be told. And I think that especially in the next couple of episodes in this series, we're going to start to get into some of the foreign films, films that were made in Europe during the war, films that were made in Europe after the war, showing the Russian side, showing Germany and France and stuff like that. So I think that's going to be really interesting because, again, these are kind of some of the big players, but the big actors on the ground are so widespread and from such diverse backgrounds that there's so many stories to be told, fictional and non-fictional, that, you just look up World War II films online and the list is practically endless, and stories beyond films and, all that stuff. So there's so much to cover. We're still just scratching the surface.
We've covered a wide range of World War II films already on the podcast. Ivan's Childhood.
Yeah, that's right. From the Russian angle. Colonel Blimp, and A Matter of Life and Death.
A Matter of Life and Death. Yes,
Yeah.
a lot of Powell and Pressburger. I mean, they were making movies around that time. It makes sense. So yes.
I actually just watched a propaganda film by Powell and Pressburger called The Volunteer, which is on Criterion Channel. So our every so often plug for Criterion Channel. It's very, very British.
But anyway, that's this episode. Next episode in the series and the season, we're going to be talking about World War II, obviously, action. So actually going down kind of in a more focused level towards the kind of gritty side of the war, the action, the fighting itself.
I think we've got a good range.
We do. It's going to be
types of movies.
It's going to be interesting.
Yeah.
So we've got a classic Hollywood style one, The Great Escape from 1963.
Steve McQueen, right? And a lot of other big
This is like
big
Steve
names,
McQueen's
huh?
breakout.
Yeah.
It's a billion stars based on a true story of POWs trying to escape. Signature theme music that's actually used in the Disney Channel show Recess.
Really?
Didn't know that.
What?
The entire show is based on The Great Escape.
What?
Have you not seen The Great Escape?
I haven't watched it yet. Nope.
Okay, go watch that.
I
Then
actually haven't seen any of these yet.
Go look up a Just Writing did something not only comparing Recess to The Great Escape, but also talking about Disney's monopoly and how they're kind of screwing themselves in the long run.
Alex's favorite topic.
Look, it's something that's going to become very prevalent.
Yeah.
I'm not even mad about it anymore because it's become reality.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
And then we're going to talk about Come and See from 1985, which was a foreign movie.
Yeah,
What
Russian.
country? Russian?
It's I think I haven't seen this movie. It's on Criterion Channel, but it's I imagine that it's going to be similar to Yvonne's childhood in the fact of it's a child who gets wrapped up in the war during the Russian invasion, but this is taking the place of another war movie that people might be very familiar with that we almost plugged in here, which is Saving Private Ryan. I know we're not actually going to cover Saving Private Ryan on the podcast. We're going to do Schindler's List, which will be our Spielberg edition. But from what I can tell, Come and See is one of the most brutal war films of all time. And since as Americans, when we think of brutal war films, we go straight to Saving Private Ryan. I thought we'd throw in a Russian film and kind of see how that stacks up.
That makes sense.
And then we'll come and see.
Exactly. And then we're going to talk about The Thin Red Line from 1998, which is by
Terrence Malick.
Which is by Terrence Malick, who is obviously a famous American auteur, one of the OG auteurs in the film Brat generation. It's got a very specific style, and he turns it towards World War II for the first time. And in the bonus podcast today, we're going to talk about another Terrence Malick film, Hidden Life, which is World War II again, but from a different angle. But anyway, that's going to be the action episode. A little bit of classic Hollywood, a little bit of new auteur cinema in America, and then a little bit of foreign film there as well. All right, Jonathan, do you want to talk about supporting the show real quick?
Yeah. So again, we have a Patreon. So if you would like to support us, you can do that. We've dropped down to only having 2 tiers. So we will have a $2 tier, which will get you access to our community, which will have polls. It will have a forum discussion soon somewhere, probably Discord, and stuff like that. Also notes that we take while we're watching these films. And then our $5 tier is the bonus podcast. And if you subscribe to that, you'll be able to hear last week's episode about Disney's propaganda films, which are highly entertaining. And then we're also going to be talking about, as Alex mentioned, A Hidden Life, which is still in theaters, leaving theaters. It's brand new.
It's on the tail end of its release.
It's brand new.
Sure.
You'll be able to catch it on streaming pretty soon. But if you want to hear our thoughts about that, tune in to the bonus podcast. We appreciate it.
Well, that's all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Garinger. 1994.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya. Alex's Criterion card.
I am carrying a card-carrying member of the Criterion channel. What does that say? From Charter subscribers since April 8th of last year.
There you go.
Do you have your?
I have it. Here's my card. I think it says April 8th because that's when they started the thing.
I think that's when they opened it up.
8th,
Yeah. Those are when the charter members joined. It makes sense.